It's a pleasure to welcome this morning Dr. Danny Carroll, the Professor of Biblical Studies and Pedagogy at Wheaton College. Migration is not new. Apparently, there's a huge piece in the Outlook section of the Washington Post this morning. I'm sure they did that because of our program. But seriously, the history of humanity is the history of migration. We read of migration in the Bible, beginning in the book of Genesis, and it's there still in the book of Revelation. What's different from biblical times is the vastly greater number of people on the move currently, and the complications that arise because of this. So what do Christians do? How do Christians respond to this pressing reality? And what can the Bible teach us today when we read the ancient text in the present? What might a scriptural approach to our global challenge be? Our speaker this morning is uniquely able to help us wrestle with the situation. Daniel Carroll received his BA from Rice University, a THM from Dallas Theological Seminary, and the PhD from the University of Sheffield in England. Dr. Carroll is half Guatemalan. He was raised in bilingual and bicultural environments. In his youth, he spent many summers in Guatemala and later taught at, I'll translate from Spanish, the Theological Seminary of Central America in Guatemala City. He did that for 13 years. The realities of Central America sparked Danny's fascination with the Old Testament. The challenges of poverty, war, and politics in those developing countries led him to a passionate focus on Old Testament social ethics and the social sciences, particularly in the Hebrew prophets. Experiences in this country and abroad have led him to a deep appreciation for the unique contributions that ethnic minorities, women, and the global church make to the understanding and interpretation of the Old Testament. Before coming to Wheaton, Dr. Carroll taught Old Testament at Denver Seminary, where Jonathan Edwards, our director of Serve Ministry, was one of his students. He was in Denver Seminary for many years, and he founded a Spanish language lay training program there. He has been involved in Latino or Latina churches and teaching on the Bible and immigration for many years. He's written numerous articles, 12 books, including biblical commentaries on the book of Amos in both English and Spanish, as well as several books on the Bible and immigration. Danny, welcome. It's great to have you with us this morning. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. I really commend the church for even approaching this topic, especially in an election environment. It's a very touchy subject. And was mentioned in the introduction, the history of the world is the history of migration. Every country in the world has its own migration history, as does this country. And so it's not surprising that there's a lot in the Bible about migration, because they're part of human history, and the people of God are moving and being moved out and in the biblical narratives. And so there's a lot in the Bible that we're not aware of. And the thing that we need to begin to do is to begin to think Christianly about this kind of thing, and not to have our narratives defined by the media, which is very easily done. Whenever I talk about this pressing issue, and I've done this for many years, the question that always comes up is, what should we do? And the question that I return with is, who is the we that you're talking about? If you're talking about the U.S. government, that's one kind of question. If you're talking about the Christian church and what we should begin to process very self-consciously out of our biblical narratives, out of our biblical revelation and our theology, is a different kind of question. And as Christians, what we need to do is to begin from our foundations, and then from there move on to the political questions that naturally arrive, that you have to get to. But that's the challenge that I want us to at least begin to put in the forefront of our mind. What does it mean to think about this as Christians? And the verses that I go to when I talk about this are Romans 12, 1 and 2. And it talks there about not being conformed to the thinking of the world. And oftentimes when I've heard sermons about this, it's about sex and drugs or something, and that's all very good. But there's also other ways that the world shapes us. It shapes us with our ideology. And oftentimes when I talk to people and talk to audiences like this one, when I hear the questions or when I hear the discussions, what I'm actually hearing is a political stance defined by a political party. And whether you're left or right, what happens is each of those sides will have a couple of favorite verses that they go to, but actually their stance has been defined by other things. So I'm trying to reverse that so that we establish our biblical foundations first. The other thing that we need to realize in these discussions, and I say this because I'm half Guatemalan, is that there's actually two audiences about this topic. Oftentimes when I speak about this, it is to primarily Anglo audiences. And for them, the foreigner or the immigrant, the migrant, the asylum seeker, the refugee, they're the foreigners who've come in. And the question is, what do we do with these foreigners that have come in? But also, you need to realize that the other audience in the discussion are the foreigners themselves. So when I begin to describe what the Bible says, and it's a massive amount of information, usually the response that I get from the Anglo audience is, wow, we didn't know that was in the Bible. Well, it's everywhere in the Bible. It's so central, in fact, that when you go to 1 Peter chapter 1 and chapter 2, migration is used as a metaphor for the Christian faith itself. We are all strangers in a strange land, we are told. That's how central the idea is to the Bible. All of us are foreigners in a very strange land, and as you look around you in this country, it's getting stranger all the time. But the other audience are the refugees and the migrants and the asylum seekers. And when I begin to share to them with all that the Bible has to say, I get the same response. When I speak to Latino audiences, the response is, wow, no sabíamos que eso estaba en la Biblia. We didn't know this was in the Bible. Well, yes, it is. But there's a whole nother step that they can begin to receive that those of us who are native born do not get firsthand. And that is that they are in the Bible. The Bible is talking about the people of God as migrants, and they are migrants. They know what it means to be strange. They know what it means to speak with an accent. They know what it means not knowing how the society works. They know what it means to try to live in a foreign land. They actually live the metaphor. And so when I speak to Latino audiences, the response is, no sabíamos que eso estaba en la Biblia. Ahí está nuestra historia. Estos son nuestras historias en la Biblia. These are our stories in the Bible, because they have the same kind of experiences. Now, when we come to this topic, another key question, besides this kind of decision to think about this as Christians, is to begin to ask, where do we begin the discussion? And oftentimes, again, the discussion has a political starting point. So the question is, do you have papers or do you not have papers? And that's an important question. But is that the best place to begin? With the political or the legal question? I would suggest a different kind of constructive starting point. And the starting point that I would suggest is the image of God in chapter 1 of Genesis. Now, when we think about the image of God, what we learn is that every human being, no matter your race, your color, your political status, where you're from, your geography, your background, your heritage, anything, every human being has worth in the sight of God. That's where we need to begin. But I want you to look at this verse, or these verses out of Genesis chapter 1. Because now, if you look at these verses and these words, what you're seeing that it is not only that we have worth, but here it says about ruling and subduing the earth. Now you're not only talking about human worth, you're also talking about human potential. These are all the gifts and abilities that humans have that make them uniquely human. Now we begin to appreciate the foreigner, not only in terms of their worth, so we can have pity on them or something. We can begin to appreciate all the value that they can bring to the national common good. And let me give you an example. One of the discussions that's been going on in this country for a decade is what are called the DACA kids. These are the kids who came with their parents when they were small. And now, because of the time they've had here, they're moving into high school, into college, and even after college. So the question is, these kids who are brought in by their parents, for instance, should we give them some kind of legal standing? An important question. But if we begin with the idea of how can we facilitate all the potential of these hundreds of thousands of young people and all their gifts for the national good, now what you begin to realize is if that's your starting point versus the legal starting point about should they even be here and do we give them permission, now the idea becomes how do we facilitate all these young people to actually help the country move forward. And now you begin to see that your starting point will change the tone and the direction and the purpose of some of those kind of very difficult legislative questions. And so what we're doing by using this starting point is stressing their humanity as the basis of the discussion and realizing that the legality issue will come. It has to come, but that's not where we begin. When I do have these discussions, and those who want to begin with the legal piece, they usually will go to Romans chapter 13. And it's in my Bible too. But I tell them, in my Bible, and this is the Bible I've brought this morning, it's about on page 1000. So the question becomes, do the previous 1,000 pages have something to say that actually will help us read that passage in a very different kind of way? So let's begin on page 1 of the Bible. We'll get to page 1000 eventually, but let's begin on page 1, Genesis chapter 1 and their humanity. Now when we move into the Old Testament, we find a lot of stories about migration, and let me just mention several of them, and I could just expand on all of these, but let me just list some, and then I'll come back and mention some of them in a little more detail. Abram or Abraham, we have Joseph. Interestingly, in Egypt, we have the reaction of a country to the foreign presence. We'll get to that in just a moment. Naomi and Ruth, that's the classic immigrant story, and it's actually going two ways. Naomi and her family moved to Moab. They are the immigrants out of Judah into Bethlehem. And then when Naomi's husband and sons die, then she and her daughter-in-law Ruth come back into Bethlehem, and now Ruth is the immigrant. And what we have in the book of Ruth is the efforts of this immigrant peasant woman to integrate into the small town or village of Bethlehem. Jeremiah sends a letter to those who've been taken away, to those who are now forced migrants, that would be the term we use today, in Babylon, but then he is also taken away into Egypt. So he's a forced migrant too, not because he's been taken away by the Babylonian forces, but because those who had been involved in a plot to kill the Babylonian governor will take him with them into Egypt, and we think that's where he probably dies. We lose track of him. But Jeremiah is an interesting story of migration. How he writes to them, and how he actually becomes a forced migrant himself. Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, these are all living in the foreign land. Ezra and Nehemiah actually come back. So what we have is what now would be called return migration. But with Esther, she's several generations in. She's not thinking about coming home, but we're going to see, if we have some time, how she begins to reclaim her heritage for the benefit of her people and the benefit of the empire itself. And there's many more. But let me go back and just talk about some of these. As you know, Abram in chapter 11, and end of chapter 11 of Genesis, is called from Ur of the Chaldees to a land he does not know. He is going to move to a place he's never been to. He will be among a people he does not seem to be aware of at all, and of course he won't speak their language. But he'll go up to Haran with his extended family. This will be on the boundary of Turkey and Syria today, and then he moves down into Palestine, we would call it today. But he is now the migrant. But it's interesting because here is the father of the faith, and the father of the faith is a migrant. Have you ever thought about that? And when God gives him this call to be a blessing to the world, what God is doing is he will bless the rest of the world and all the nations of the earth through a migrant family. And if you read the narratives of Genesis, he never owns any land until he buys a plot of ground to bury his wife Sarai. But even the first story of when they're in the land, what we find later on in chapter 12, that there was a famine. Again, this is one of the reasons why people migrate, because they're trying to survive and eat. And so he takes his family, his extended family, and they begin to move to Egypt. Now, we know from archaeology that there was a series of forts on the eastern frontier of Egypt. Egypt had the Nile, they had water, and so they had crops, and so they're always dealing with people who are coming in looking for food. And this is what Abram and his family are doing. And it may be at one of these checkpoints, as they approach it, that Abram will say to Sarai, "Look, if they ask you, tell them that you're my sister and not my wife." Now, if we begin to think about that story, what we begin to see is that they are so desperate to eat that here is the father of the faith willing to lie to get across a border to survive. The other option is to go back and die. On the other hand, we have Sarai, the woman, who is willing to put literally her body at risk and be taken into the harem of the Pharaoh so that the extended family can eat. This is how desperate they are to survive as migrants. Now we begin to read the Abraham story in a different kind of way. With Joseph, it's different. He's a forced migrant in an interesting kind of way, as you know the story. He is sold human trafficking by merchants who are going by, and then he is sold into Egypt. He's hardworking and honest, and he's now in the house of Potiphar, and he begins to work his way up, and now he becomes head or steward of the household. As you know, the wife tries to seduce him, and he tries to run away. But who do you think the Egyptian authorities are going to believe? Are they going to believe the Egyptian or the foreigner? Well, they take the Egyptian's word. He goes to prison. He interprets dreams, and he comes out. He's made second in the land. So now you have a migrant who's now number 2 in Egypt. He's given an Egyptian name. He's given an Egyptian wife. He obviously now speaks the language. He knows how the government works. But when they have 2 sons, he gives them Israelite, not Egyptian names. You see, he still has his heritage in the back of his mind. Now, when his brothers come, again looking for food, and they are presented to him, he understands what they're saying, though he has an interpreter standing by him. But he understands what they're saying, and he goes behind the curtain and he weeps. You see, he never forgot his mother tongue. Es bilingüe. Tanto su idioma materno como el idioma de Egipto. Not only his mother language, but also the language of Egypt. And he tells his family, look, when I die, take my bones home. And home for him is back in Canaan. It's interesting, too, because this narrative will tell us that the Egyptians despised shepherds. And what was his father and his family? A bunch of shepherds. And toward the end of the narrative, he presents the old man, Jacob, because Jacob and the other brothers have come with their families to escape the famine. We have family reunification, if you want to use that word that we use now in our politics. And so he presents his father, the old man Jacob, to the Pharaoh. What were his feelings? Was he embarrassed? Was he ashamed of his father? This was the kind of person that the Egyptians despised. Interesting dynamics going on with Joseph. On the other hand, if you just turn the page from Genesis into Exodus, the Egyptians. And what are the Egyptians afraid of? The numbers of the foreign presence, the numbers of the foreign workers. And so what they do to control the population is they put into place these draconian laws to eliminate the baby boys because they fear national security, that these young boys will grow up and then turn against the government. And so they put these laws into place. And that's a very fascinating story. But what I want you to capture in all of this, and listen to the narrative, even as they despise the Israelites and are afraid of them, they still want them to work. These are the workers who build the Egyptian buildings. Now, what's fascinating and contradictory about all of this, the Israelites have to build Egyptian buildings. They're not building buildings for themselves. And because we know how they used to build those buildings, they would use mud, and then they would lace the mud with straw. That makes the bricks solid so they don't collapse. But the Egyptians have them look for their own straw, but they keep the quota the same. They're actually making it more difficult and more dangerous for the Egyptians themselves in the building with those bricks. This makes no economic sense. They need the bricks to be well made. They need the bricks for building their buildings, but they're making it harder for them to work and actually making it possible that the bricks won't be as strong as they need to be. This is economically contradictory, but it's laced with prejudice and fear against the foreign labor force. Naomi and Ruth, I've already mentioned that. But here's the interesting piece that sometimes we miss. When Naomi's husband and sons died, she says, I just want to go home. I hear it's better there now. She tries to convince her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, to stay in Moab. And Orpah will stay, but Ruth will go back. And she says, I'll go with you. And your people will be my people, and your God, my God, and I will die with you. And if you read the narrative carefully, Naomi says nothing. And then when they get to Bethlehem, the women of the town come out and they're weeping and they're hugging Naomi. Ruth isn't even mentioned. She's probably standing over there in a corner by herself, feeling awkward, ignored. That was a strange kind of scene. And Naomi says, I'm a bitter woman because God has taken everything away from me. And there's Ruth, who's giving her life to her mother-in-law. She works in the fields in chapter 2. And then when Boaz comes, Boaz says, who's that woman over there? Maybe she was dressed differently. He doesn't recognize her. And the workers say, oh, that's the Moabite woman. And she's with Naomi. They don't know her name. They just know her by her work. That sounds so familiar when I speak to Latinos. Oh, those Mexicans, they really work hard. We don't know their names, but you know what? 7 a.m, they're out doing the landscaping, and they're doing the construction, and they're cleaning the houses. They're the invisible people whose name we do not know. Story of Ruth. And by the end of the book, as you know, she marries Boaz. They have a son, Obed. And the women of the town who had ignored Ruth at the beginning say to Naomi, this woman, she loves you more than 7 sons. And again, Naomi doesn't say a word. But she takes the boy. Maybe now she'll fully accept her foreign daughter-in-law. And Obed, this half-breed, I'm a half-breed, a Guatemalan mother and an American father. Obed becomes a key link to David and ultimately to Jesus. This poor peasant migrant woman changes the direction of history itself. I've already mentioned Jeremiah, Ezra, Nehemiah. It's interesting. They go back, and Ezra doesn't want anything to do with the empire. I mean, he'll use the empire to get back, but he's very strict about their following the Jewish laws. Nehemiah actually works for the government. He's loyal to the empire, and he comes back and helps rebuild the walls. And that's an interesting story too, because why would the empire allow a foreign presence to rebuild the walls. That would be a recipe for insurrection against the government on the very edge of the empire itself. Well, we know from history that the Greeks were rising in the Mediterranean, and so perhaps the building of the wall is to protect the empire's southwestern flank. And the only person that the king can trust to do this and not rebel against the government is Nehemiah, his trusted advisor. Esther, multi-generational, but now she begins to regain all her Jewish identity and is willing now at the end to step forward with that. And I see this with Latino students at Wheaton College. Some of them second and third generation. Do I speak Spanish or do I not? What do I do with my parents? What do I do with my culture? You see, what people have to realize that are native born is that for the immigrant or the asylum seeker or the refugee, life becomes a constant negotiation of loss. Loss of food, loss of language, loss of nonverbal language, loss of the way you do life and how you do family. You're always giving something away. And I've been in Latino churches where the parents are speaking Spanish, the kids are speaking English, the father and the mother will speak to their children in Spanish or some kind of English, and the kids respond in English. I was talking to a young woman at a seminary, a Latina, about preaching in Latino churches, and she came up to me afterward and said, you know, most of the room was empty. And she said, all my life I've wanted to be white. And I've given up so much. And I took her hand and I said, hermana, tú eres morena. Sister, you're brown. Esto no cambia. This doesn't change. And she looked at me with tears in her eyes and she goes, how do I find my way back? These are the kinds of things that these second and third generation people are wrestling with. And if you go back in American history, whether your background is German or Swedish or Norwegian or Italian, that was the same trauma of those first, second, and third generations as well. There's so many more stories, but I need to move on because I've got a time limit. So there's a lot of Old Testament laws, actually. There's no other law code in the ancient world that we have found, and we found a good number of them, that have anything close to what we have in the Old Testament. It's unique in terms of its care for outsiders. Not only the amount of legislation, but also its breadth. And what we find in the ancient world is that outsiders, if you were thinking about ancient Israel, would be very vulnerable. It was a peasant society primarily. We think maybe 95% of the people were peasant farmers. And so the key for a peasant economy is to own land. But if you're a foreigner, what is the thing you don't have is land, especially in ancient Israel where everything would go through the family, through the firstborn son. So you're vulnerable because you don't have any property. Also, in the ancient world, you didn't have social services. There were no public hospitals. There was no Social Security. So you were taken care of by your extended family. So if you got sick, or somebody died, or a birth, or a war, or maybe your animal got sick, an animal that would give you milk, let's say your goats, or the sheep that would give you, the wool for clothing. If any of these things happen, what kind of recourse did you have as a foreigner? Because one of the things that you would not have would be an extended family. So we have a very vulnerable foreign presence. And we had this idea, as we look at the data, that these foreigners were kind of day workers. You see this with Jesus in the parable of the man coming to the town square to hire workers. These are kind of like what we might imagine. People going to the central square, waiting for daily work. I don't know what it's like in the D.C. area, but if you go to all over the country, go to a Home Depot parking lot or a certain part of the city, you'll find a bunch of men kind of hanging around, waiting for someone to come by and pick them up and give them some work so they can eat and take care of their family. This is the same kind of thing that you would have seen in the ancient world. This isn't anything new. So as we think about it, what would the law do to meet these needs? Well, I can't rehearse all of that here, but we have provisions for food. This is what you have Ruth doing. She's allowed to glean in the field, not only as a widow, but also as a foreigner. What you have too, which is interesting, is that they're to have fair wages paid on time. This is one of the things that you find throughout human history. What do people do with foreign workers? Well, they take advantage of them. They don't pay them as well, and they don't give them a sure wage, and they don't pay them on time often. I've talked to Latinos who've worked, and they're told, if you come to this address at a certain time, I'll give you your money, and they show up and no one is there. And so they've been taken advantage of. Well, this isn't anything new. So the law says fair wages and to be paid on time. There also, if you look at the Sabbath laws in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, it says, every seventh day you'll rest, and it talks about your wife and your sons and your daughters. And then it says, and the foreigners in your midst. Again, what do people do with foreign labor? They don't give them time off. And so what you find oftentimes, people working on highways or people doing other kinds of work are immigrants on a Sunday. They don't get rest. The Old Testament recognizes this is what people do to foreign workers. And so they too have a right to rest, fair wages, on time, rest. Another thing that's interesting is that there are a number of feasts that explicitly say allow the foreigner to participate. Now Israel is opening up the most precious thing that they have, which is their life with God. So you begin to see that the law is doing some things that we would never see in the rest of the ancient world. And those laws, we can't imitate the laws. We're not a peasant society. But the kind of moral principles and convictions that lie behind those laws also can be reflected in the Christian church. The question is, if you were an ancient Israelite, why do we do this? Who cares? Well, the law actually gives us two primary reasons for taking care of the foreigner. And let me talk about the first one, which is the person of God himself. And look at these verses out of Deuteronomy chapter 10. You'll see that I've highlighted the phrase that God loves the alien or the foreigner. And you are to love those who are aliens, for you yourselves were aliens in Egypt. And we'll come back to that last phrase in just a moment. But basically what he's saying is, I care for vulnerable people, and foreigners are vulnerable. I love the foreigner. And so, you are to love the foreigner too. And what you begin to realize, this is where it gets uncomfortable, is how well we love the foreigner is a reflection of how well we love God. And so people ask me, well, why should we care about the immigrant? My answer is, because God does. I can't give you a better answer than that. But he also reminds them at the end of this verse, or these verses, about their history. Don't forget your history. Over and over again he says, you are to take care of the foreigner because you were foreigners in Egypt. You are to take care of the foreigner because you were an exploited worker in Egypt. Now in this country, we have some memories, and let me look at these very quickly. I have three cartoons, political cartoons from the 1880s and 1890s. Look at this one. This is an interesting one. A wall. It's a metaphor in the 1880s. The first national law is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which prohibited any Chinese to come in, with very, very, very few exceptions, into the country. And so you see that they've pushed the ladder off of the wall, and someone has just made it over. And you can see the caricature of the Chinese at the bottom. We would call them coolies. We actually brought them in after the California Gold Rush in 1849 to help build the railroads. And that's where we get the influx of Chinese. But we stopped this in 1882. That law was not rescinded until 1943. But here you have the metaphor of the wall, which now is actually a concrete reality in our southern border. Some of you may be from an Irish background. My father was the son of Irish immigrants. And look how they perceive the Irish. The Irish who came were very, very poor. You had the potato famine in the mid to the years following in the 19th century, so you have a major influx of very poor farmers out of Ireland, and this is how the Irish were perceived. You have a gun in one hand, a knife that's dripping blood in the other, another knife in the belt, along with a bludgeon, and you see the man cowering before him. This is the Irish Frankenstein. This is an interesting cartoon. You see the White House in the background, Uncle Sam at the gate, United States of America, admittance free, walk in, welcome. And look at the foreigner at the gate. Now we think it may be a Jew from Eastern Europe just because of the caricature of what he's wearing. He's carrying poverty and disease. This is what people assume all foreigners will bring. And then the Sabbath desecration tells you you're in the mid or your late 19th century. But here's the irony of it all. You have this sign to walk in, but there is Uncle Sam holding his nose. This is the tension that we have throughout American history and really every country in the world. I've been in several countries. I've been in Guatemala, I've been in Argentina, I've been in Europe, in the UK, in Spain, in France, all of them worried about foreign presence, and also Australia. This is not unique to the US. This is a global phenomenon throughout history. But there's the tension. We want them, but we don't want them. Interestingly, the very same decade that we have the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, that's the very same decade that we have the building of the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. And there's the tension. Now, I need to move very quickly. I've only got about 5 minutes, and then we have some questions. Jesus, he begins his life as a refugee, fleeing Herod into Egypt. So this is actually part of Jesus' lived experience. His teaching, he doesn't speak specifically about migration, but he talks about vulnerable people. He talks about the Gentiles, but he also talks about widows and takes care of widows. He feeds the hungry. He talks and walks with the sick and actually touches lepers and all these kinds of things. The outcasts, the prostitutes, for instance, the people who collect taxes, all these kinds of things Jesus is making part of his ministry. And these are vulnerable people in our midst, and so we would learn from Jesus there. The parable of the Good Samaritan. Often when we think about that parable in Luke chapter 10, we think, oh, we just need to be good people. Well, that's not actually what the story is talking about in its primary sense, because it's triggered by the question of a teacher of the law. Jesus had talked with him to respond to his question about how do I inherit eternal life, and Jesus says, well, you need to obey the commandments. I've done that. And you need, to love God, but you need to love your neighbor. The question is, well, who's my neighbor? And Jesus talks about the Good Samaritan. And as you know the story, the Samaritan is the one who stops and helps. And so Jesus says, in the story, who is the neighbor of the man who was robbed? Remember, the triggering question was, who is the neighbor I'm supposed to love? So Jesus says, well, who's the neighbor in the story? The answer is the Samaritan, the despised people by the Jews. And this teacher of the law can't even bring himself to say Samaritan. He says, oh, the man who helped the other guy. The very people that his people despised are the people they are to love. The Great Commissions are to go to the world. He's actually calling his church to migrate for the sake of the gospel. And if you move in a new job, a new start, maybe marriage, maybe we go for education. But we've actually crossed state lines. Now what you have is people crossing international lines. But the phenomena is the same. That's a wonderful observation. In fact, I was in a church in Denver. If you ever lived in Denver, I did for 20 years. Like, no one's from Denver. There's probably like 5 people from Denver. Everyone kind of moves to the mountains, right? And so I was in this church with like 500 people. And I said, how many of you are not from Colorado? And about 400 hands went up. And I said, there it is. Internal migration. Now, one last thing. If you were to go to a country like, well, Ukraine would be the easy one, or Colombia, you have millions of internal migration, but they're called internally displaced people. So you have within the country itself people moving because of war. Now, we don't have that in this country. Mostly it's for economic and personal reasons, but in other countries it's actually migration internally because of war, trying to escape the violence. Great observation.
The elephant in the room probably is that given employers will hire immigrants over citizens because they don't have to pay for benefits like insurance, workman's comp, unemployment,
Yeah.
and immigrants do not pay tax. So the Americans that have been displaced by immigrants are forced to fall back on social services such as food assistance, rent assistance, and whatnot. We undermine our tax base because the immigrants don't pay tax, but the Americans who have been displaced have to fall back on that system and take from the tax. Shouldn't Congress pass laws that require employers who hire immigrants to pay the equivalent amount that they would pay for an American citizen into the tax base, and to require immigrants to pay some kind of tax, like a privilege tax?
Yeah, these are getting into the policy issues. And let me just respond quickly on a couple of ways. One is, many people don't know this. There's a lot of disinformation publicly, is that if you're an immigrant, you can actually get a tax number. I have friends who are what we would call undocumented that have tax numbers, and they pay their taxes. And so I was asking one of them, he was from Matamoros, which is right across the border from Brownsville in Texas, owns a carpet cleaning business in Denver. And so I said, do you pay taxes? He says, yes, I do. And I said, how do you do that? He says, well, I got a tax number. And I said, well, if the government knows where you are, aren't you afraid that they'll come and deport you? He says, no. Because, he said, and this is true, which is interesting, most people don't know this, there are actually many, many, many immigrants who pay taxes. They have a tax number. But the IRS will not inform immigration services about these people, because these people are actually funneling billions of dollars into the Social Security system to help keep it afloat, even though they will never be able to draw a penny from Social Security because they're undocumented. So it doesn't behoove the IRS to inform immigration about these hundreds of thousands, actually, of immigrants who pay taxes. And so we actually benefit from this. The other thing that I would say is that the easiest thing to do, if people are worried about taxes, is to give these people a means to acquiring citizenship, however you want to set that up. And then the tax issue is solved. So that would be an easy one to fix. But it's so politicized that people won't touch it. But that would be the easiest way to do it. When I asked my friend, I said, so why do you pay taxes? He says, well, as a Christian, Romans 13, I pay my taxes. And he said, and my hope is that whenever the laws are passed, they will see me as a good person and allow me to get my legal status. I've talked to others, and they've told me, I don't care if I get citizenship, just give me legal status. I'll pay whatever you want, just let me raise my kids. All of these other stories never make it into some of the media. So this is where we need to be careful and process it primarily as Christians, and secondly, to have more information than perhaps just a single information feeder into us, because each side, left or right, will leave out information to actually support their point of view.
Well, when I was about 17 years old, I had the opportunity to work with Mexicanos. We did not have Latinos in the 1940s. They were mostly Mexicanos, and I was born in something part that was once part of Mexico. Okay, so a cousin and I decided we'd go down and see what it's like to pick grapefruit. Now, the picture that so many of us had at that time of the Mexicanos came from like seeing things that actually came out of Mexico itself, that you could buy in border towns, of a sleeping little guy in a saguaro leaning back against, in a sombrero, leaning back against a saguaro cactus. So the picture was Mexicanos are lazy. Well, then we wait for the truck to come. We have one white guy, and then us two teenagers, and then everybody else are migrant workers from Mexico. And I want to tell you something. We could not keep up with those people. Those people worked their little tushy-wushies off. And man, I survived 2 days at 17, right? Maybe a little over $3 a day. These guys were probably making maybe more than $12. We were paid 7 cents a crate for the grapefruit. People had to come and pick things to get the machinery off of the truck so they could get the next thing that would move the grapefruit up into the truck. So the thing for me was those people worked hard, and you did not have many of us gringos. I mean, the next day we went out, it was one black, and he kind of stuck with us because I think he maybe felt a little uncomfortable. My question is, why is it a problem for people to come and do work that some of the rest of us really don't want to do?
Yeah. I would say a couple of things. You're right. I mean, there's actually a bill in the House of Representatives that's bipartisan, and I want to say from Idaho or something. It's a farmer agricultural bill, because this country cannot survive without immigrant labor on our farms. Most of our food is picked, as you were saying, largely by undocumented workers who are exploited and live in terrible conditions because it's cheaper to get it to our grocery stores. So that's a wonderful case. And let me add something too. Another thing that I hear in the media is, they're all kind of rapists and drug lords or something. And this is where our theology helps us. And if let me, as a brother in Christ, let me just say something. None of your questions have been biblical questions or theological questions. I've been doing this for 15 years, even with pastors. And in my 15 years, I've never heard one question about the Bible. That's pretty telling. So let me add another biblical piece. When people say, there's some really bad people among the immigrants, I go, yeah, there are some really terrible people. And if you, a Bible-believing Christian, you should expect this. It's called sin, and all of us are sinners. And I don't care if you're white, black, brown, yellow, and everything in between, there is a certain percentage of that race that is really bad. So why would I expect every immigrant to be good? So I don't need to defend all the immigrants. I don't need to defend every white person in this country. I don't need to defend every African American in this country. A Bible-believing Christian would just assume that a certain percentage of each of those races are really bad people. And so you're going to get some bad ones too. That's just human. But you don't exclude the millions who are good because of the exceptions in any race you want to talk about that are bad. But yes, good question.
You didn't make a distinction in your comments between immigrants who enter legally and those who enter illegally. I just wondered how you view that.
Again, very good question and a complicated one. When people, sometimes, and I don't know you, my sister, oftentimes they say that, but they don't even know what U.S. immigration law is. So let me give you a couple of points to respond. The U.S. immigration system is based on quotas, certain visa categories. And these quotas were established many, many years ago. And for instance, the quota nationally per year for unskilled labor, this would be like for farming or for construction, the national quota is 5,000 to 10,000 a year. We estimate that we need about 500,000. But the quotas have never been changed. About 10 years ago, under the Bush administration actually, there was an attempt to set the quota system to economic need, which makes common sense. But it never made it out of the Senate. So what you're seeing is these laws are antiquated, contradictory, and the quotas don't even reflect reality anymore. The other thing that people don't realize is that under current U.S. law, and we're seeing it under the present administration in the problem that is created, is that current U.S. law is about entry. If you come into this country without papers and you're in, there's nothing in current U.S. law that can handle you. Now, what most people don't know is at least 40% of the undocumented came in legally. They come in through tourist visas, they come in through temporary worker visas, they come in through student visas, and they just stay. So when people talk about the border as the problem, I'm going, you don't even know the immigration realities of this country. So what we have then, because there is nothing that can be done for these people, so when they say, well, why don't they get right with the law? Well, the answer is there is nothing under current U.S. law that allows them to get right with the law. Once they're in, it's over. There's nothing there. The only thing that current U.S. law stipulates for people without documentation in the country is deportation. There is no pathway to legal status. That's why the whole DACA thing with the young people has been on the table for over a decade. One of the only exceptions that can allow a person to get legal status is if a woman is being abused. There's a special visa that they can apply for as the victim of abuse. So this is where the question is this: how can we reform U.S. law, not only to reflect the realities of national economic need, but also to have some kind of order in terms of how it's done? And that's part of the problem with the present administration. It's kind of a chaos. And then, as a Christian, the question is, what would the laws look like if we talked about it from a Christian perspective and not just from a U.S. certain kind of American perspective? So, great question. It's actually the question that every country in the world is asking. Guatemala is having immigration issues as well. And in Guatemala, it's not only people coming in, because they are, from El Salvador and Nicaragua, they're also losing people coming north, as well as having people come back. So even a country like Guatemala is in the midst of a very complicated immigration discussion. But again, I would just encourage everyone to go to the scriptures.
In the Old Testament, God's people engage in a lot of ethnic cleansing.
Yes.
Because they're told to stamp out diversity, at least religious diversity. How do we fit that into the narrative?
Good question. So there's probably two things you're talking about. One is the conquest in Joshua, which is a one-off event, so it never is even suggested to be anything more than that one-off event, so that's really off the table. The other event that you might be talking about is Ezra and Nehemiah and the foreign wives. I don't know if that's what you're talking about. You can see some of the issues that are involved. It's not ethnic cleansing, it's actually just separation, because this is very different than our world. For us, religion is an add-on, and religion is something that we can take or leave, and even if we say we're believers, it may be tangential to our actually daily life and rhythms of life. But for the Jews in Ezra and Nehemiah's time, it wasn't. And if you realize what the other religions were suggesting that people do and how they live in terms of things like child sacrifice, you can see in Nehemiah, he says this in chapter 13, that one of the things that they're really worried about is that their children no longer speak their language. Okay, you're hearing the same thing you hear today. They're losing their children, and they're losing their children to other gods, other sacrifices, other ways of doing life and organizing your government and doing family. All these things are being changed because of the interreligious marriages. Their very survival as a people is at stake because their faith is central to their life. This is what's so different about today. If we're brutally honest, our faith is not central to our life. We can go to church or we can't go to church. We can contribute our tithing or not do our tithing. We can be involved in missions or not be involved in missions. I was hearing you about homeless people. God bless this church for that. Oh, I don't want to do that, you know? And so you have this, you know, our faith becomes kind of an add-on that we can kind of choose or not choose to be involved in. That's not what you see going on in ancient Israel in the book of Nehemiah and even Ezra. There it's not about cleansing, it's about separation, but because of these very deep issues that I've just told you about. A good biblical question. Thank you.
Let's thank Dr. Carroll again. Danny, I had the sense that you just said, come over here and look at all that you know from this angle, and my eyes were opened today, and I think many of our eyes were as well. So thank you for your commitment to reading the Bible the way that you are, and to making this voice in Scripture heard.
As you can probably tell, or maybe not, as a Christian, I think both U.S. political parties are wrong on this. And so my idea is a curse on both their houses. So I think both political parties are wrong. They're both doing wrong things biblically. So please don't take this as some kind of endorsement of a political party. As a Christian, I can't see where either of them represent the fullness of Scripture. I wouldn't expect them to because they're secular parties. But anyway, I just wanted to leave that. This is why we need to go to the Scriptures. But thank you.
Appreciate that. And let's go to the Lord now. Gracious God, we thank you for the challenges that are in this book that we've been reading for a long, long time. And we thank you for Dr. Carroll and his ability to help us to look at it from an oblique or a slant. Lord, open our hearts, not just our eyes, to know how to respond faithfully as your people in the midst of a city, a culture that is so full of political conversation and solution. Lord, would you lead us as individuals, as this congregation, to a faithful response to whether it's the proximity to the homeless or simply knowing the names of those who work for us who are otherwise nameless. Grow in us a compassion, Lord, for your people that you have. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.